Man, the mic was muted the whole time, wasn't it? My name is. Uh, you know what? Let's just do everything over. Welcome to the Merciless Opinion with Sir Merciless. I am your host, Sir Merciless. Viewer discretion is advised. That is your warning. Today we're doing a Throwback Thursday. We're throwing it back to SEGA tonight. One of the more prevalent names of the late 80s, early 90s gaming console wars, the rival to Nintendo at one point. As I pull my own stream up here, get into the comments, look over. Here in just a moment, I will be going over a timeline. There we go. Now I got all my comments up. Let's just see if the tablet decides to stand up tonight. I'm going to give it a few moments, let people come in, trickle in like they normally do. In between times, how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's had a good day. It's Thursday, tomorrow's Friday, and then that's it until the weekend. Just one more work day for everybody, right? I got us some Milo's 0 calories, sugar-free sweet tea. I don't know how they've done it. Probably use Splendor or something along those lines. But yeah, throwback tonight is for SEGA. And as I see people come in, I will swap screens over and we will talk about SEGA just for a little bit. And then I'll probably go through the history, read it off for you guys. And then we will get your guys' comments, questions, or any kind of concerns that SEGA gave for you while you might have been growing up with it. I know that in my home, the first system we had was the Super Nintendo. And then later on, I got a Sega Genesis, and then I had a Sega Game Gear. My cousin had a Sega Dreamcast, which was an amazing system, way ahead of its time, to be honest. Yeah, as you join in, say something, and we'll get rolling. Let me make sure some folks know that I'm up and rolling. I can actually edit that message. Let me pull the comments back up here. Again, as I'm doing these things, I do plan on going over some analytics this weekend. I feel like I need to do better quality videos for you folks instead of quantity. I understand the viewer fatigue is real, so I'm not wanting to wear you guys out on the things and topics I like. I enjoy speaking about, and I love giving you guys the open floors on Wednesdays and Fridays. So those are not going to go anywhere as far out as I can see. As far as Tuesdays and Thursdays, they are kinda in the air. I like doing Tech Tuesdays. I ain't gonna lie to you. Tech Tuesdays has been a lot of fun. I've learned quite a bit of things, and there's been quite a few comments on those. Thursdays throwbacks, I might change that up, just because I feel like throwbacks are kind of cliche and a little overdone. So this may be the last Throwback Thursday for a while. I am gonna either figure out how to replace it, or just replace Thursdays altogether. And I guess let's turn on our screen. There we go. Let's pop this on. Alright, and we're getting into SEGA. I've already done a little bit of reading here. Let's go all the way up to the key points. So the key points in it is, in its prime, SEGA was a console juggernaut and even rivaled Nintendo, as I said, in the early years of the console wars. Origins of SEGA can be traced all the way back to standard games in 1940s. In the beginning, they created coin-operated slot machines to entertain GIs on Hawaii military bases. I did not know that. SEGA was very profitable during the arcade boom of the 80s and netting well over $200 million in revenue with games like Zaxxon, Outrun. They also licensed legendary titles like Pac-Man and Frogger. In October of '88, SEGA landed a huge blow against rival Nintendo with the SEGA Genesis, often regarded, rightfully so, as the greatest console SEGA ever released. The SEGA Genesis goes down in history as one of the most important consoles ever built. With Sonic the Hedgehog's high-speed hijinks, the power of the Genesis, and Sega's pull-no-punches attitude, the SEGA Genesis has cemented itself in the pantheon of gaming history. If you look at SEGA today, it might be hard to believe that they were once one of the biggest names in gaming. In its prime, SEGA was a console juggernaut, and even rival Nintendo in the early years of the console wars. SEGA is still part of the conversation, but they don't make consoles anymore. That's unfortunate. They focus mostly on third-party game development for their legendary franchises like Sonic the Hedgehog. Alright. So, a lot of the things I said, I did not know that they built slot machines for GIs on Hawaii military bases. That's kind of cool. Well, I guess Standard Games did. Everybody knows Sonic was Mario's rival. If you consider yourself a gamer, you know that. And everybody knows that Sega's kind of falling by the wayside. And every now and then you do hear about, Sonic the Hedgehog coming out with a new game. Last few of them haven't been the greatest. There was one that was at least playable, because I did play through it all the way. But let's get into the early history. The 40s, coin-operated slot machines, GIs, Hawaii military bases. As they grew, they relocated to Japan and rebranded as Service Games. Funny enough, the name SEGA comes from this iteration. It was used as an abbreviation for Service Games. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Over the years, SEGA went through several iterations before it finally merged with Verizon Enterprises in 1965 and became SEGA Enterprises. That year, they released the arcade game Periscope, a submarine shooter simulator which was very popular at the time. SEGA had other 1965. When did Atari come out? It must have been okay. Arcade games, yeah, okay. What was that? A submarine shooter simulator which was very popular at the time. SEGA had several other hits during the arcade boom, like the successful Zaxxon, 1982, Outrun, 1986, and they also led Pac-Man and Frogger. Out of the arcade into the home, SEGA was very profitable during the arcade boom of the 80s, netting well over $200 million in revenue, which is quite a bit back in the 80s. I mean, it's quite a bit now still, but I mean, in the 80s, $200 million hit different. I wonder. Let's just look that up real quick. Like, 200 million in the 1980s compared to today. Is this sponsored or an ad? Oh, let's just I put in 19. Yeah, screw it. Let's just do it. $200 million in 1980 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $740,555,825.24 today. Oh my goodness, almost about $1 billion. Look at what is it? Inflation rate of 3.9% per year between 1980 and today, producing a cumulative price increase of 270.28%. That means that today's prices are 3.7 times as high as average prices since 1980. Wow. So yeah, they were making bank back in the day. Almost $1 billion a year, man. Compared to today's price, like 200 million from 80 to today's. Okay, absolutely insane. So they were making some big bank back then. $200 million in revenue. Sadly, the arcade era was ending, and Sega had to set its sights on the next big thing. That thing ended up starting the console wars between Sega and what would be their biggest rival, Nintendo. Sega kicked off this fight for home entertainment dominance with the SG-1000, their first real home console. And that looks to be a Genesis there. Let's see if we can... SG-1000. Let's look that up. Let's let people have a look at it. Sega SG-1000 images. There you go. Here's a look at it. Looks like just a fairly simple controller. Cartridge style games. And it's actually a pretty slick little console. That reminds me of like what Nintendo would be in the, man. I have never seen one of these, so give me just a couple of moments to look it over. And wow, look at that. What is this? Oh, that's a Sega SG-1002. Okay. I think I like the SG-1000 design better. That just looks really slick. Like imagine coming like in the 80s, early 90s. You come home and like it's your birthday, or you went to school on your birthday, and you come home and that's sitting underneath your big tube television or on top of it. And it's hooked up there waiting for you to play Zaxxon or Frogger or whatever these two games are. Oh man. So the SG-1000 was released on the exact same day as the Nintendo Famicom, or Family Computer. Let's actually go look that up as well. Nintendo Famicom. Let's see what that looked like. I've never even heard of that one. Let's look at that. Okay. The Family Computer looked like, it came, looks like it came with two built-in controllers. Okay, and maybe, oh, see, that's what we had when I was growing up. Actually, that game right there too. That was my first system right here, the Super Nintendo NES with the Super Mario World. And we had both of those, and I don't think they paid $260 for it back then. But the Famicom, it's got a little neat little design there. It's got a little spot you can put the controllers. The controllers look like they're built in. Okay, I got you. Famicom and blew past sales expectations in the first year. They originally projected to sell around 50,000 by the end of 1983, but the end number of units sold was around 160,000. Between its initial release in '88 and 1988, it sold 1.4 million units, making it a financial success. However, this console didn't make the splash that Sega was hoping for. Wow. How do you say that? Like, you wanted to sell 50,000 by the end of '83, but the end number of units sold was around 160,000. You surpassed your expectation, your projection by 110,000 units. I think I'm seeing what might have made Sega fall already, just by reading just this little bit of history on it. The original SG-1000 had a TMS9918A video display processor that rendered 2D sprite graphics. It had an 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor and 1 kilobyte of RAM. Wow. The controller, the SJ200 joystick, was attached to the SG-1000. Eventually, Sega updated the console and released the SG-1002, which had a new design and controller, the SJ-150 joypad, a closer analog to Nintendo's Famicom controller. The I would say the systems lineup was solid. Well, okay, I'm gonna ad lib here. The systems lineup was solid. It had titles like James Bond, 007, and Space Invaders, which brought the classic arcade game into the living room for the first time, even before Atari. Okay, maybe it meant for the first time for them, or maybe just the first time for those titles. Brought classic arcade games into living. Okay, yeah, let's go with the titles. The first time. Unfortunately for Sega, they couldn't compete with more recognizable titles like Donkey Kong and Popeye on the Famicom. They even released a game called Congo Bongo, similar to Nintendo's Donkey Kong. Congo Bongo. Master System, the SG-1000 and SG-1002 were fairly successful, but Sega was looking for more. So in '85, Sega decided to drop the name association and released the Sega Mark III, which fell flat during its Japanese launch. It upgraded the design and processing power, but lacked memorable titles, and didn't really have anything that drew in players, new or old. So we can see here that they're already kind of having to piggyback off Nintendo for Donkey Kong with Congo Bongo, um, and they feel like they fell flat doing this, selling 110,000 more units by the end of the year. Uh, what they should have done, in personal opinion, what they should have done is instead of, you know, which it's always a good thing to upgrade your system. But what they should have done was got on board with getting a mascot type deal, because at this point Donkey Kong was already out, and Nintendo could continue making Donkey Kong games, and they did for quite a while. I haven't heard of a new Donkey Kong game releasing a while, so. But Mario comes out like every other year. So by the time they released this Mark III, they were behind the 8 ball on getting like a recognizable game, like a like what am I wanting to do here? Like a marquee game that's gonna set the bar, at least for their systems that they're coming out with. Uh, because they upgraded the system. Obviously, it did the processing power more than 1 kilobyte, I'd imagine. Uh, After this failure during the Japanese launch, the company rebranded the console as the Master System for the North American release. Still didn't have the traction that Sega hoped for, but it did introduce some amazing games like the Prince of Persia. Okay, so now I know that those games did come out on Nintendo GameCube as well, so Nintendo must have bought the Prince of Persia or had their own version of it. Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and of course, Sonic the Hedgehog. So the Mark III, or Master System for the North American release, is the first system to have Sonic. So this right here is going to be a benchmark for them. Sonic the Hedgehog right here. So yeah, this is the console that first brought Sonic the Hedgehog into the living rooms of America. Alright. Once again, however, Nintendo sold a lot more of its North American rebrand, the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, than Sega did its Master System. This is a trend that we will see play out in every single generation. Sega released the Master System 2, which was much more advanced than the NES, but by then it didn't matter. In North America, Nintendo was king, but the fight was far from over. So this is what, where's the date at? 1988? 89? Where's it at? They didn't give us a year on that. Nope, not seeing it. We'll go with 88. I'm thinking this is more like 89, 90. And there's Sonic there. The Genesis, and here we go. Here's an updated date. Genesis / Mega Drive. In October '88, Sega landed a hell of a blow against rival Nintendo with the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside the US, often regarded, rightfully so, as the greatest console Sega ever released. The Sega Genesis goes down in history as one of the most important consoles ever built. Sega started with a fresh design from the ground up. It had new, better control that felt good and had quick responsiveness. It was also the first 16-bit console, so it was faster and had more colors than before. Despite its impressive power and lineup of 16-bit games, Sega Genesis still couldn't compete with the Super Nintendo, the SNES. Nintendo had been kicking Sega's butt since the beginning of the console wars due to their stronger stable of titles and family-friendly marketing. Nintendo had marketed themselves as a family company, and they already had a great part of their market share when the Genesis was released, so Sega had to bring out the big guns in order to keep up. See, that's something Nintendo has apparently always done well. They're always the family friendly, the kid friendly console game titles. Uh, that is their share of the market. While uh, other consoles, Xbox, Sony, or Microsoft, Sony, and PC, uh, they don't necessarily have to do the whole family friendly thing. Um, because they were smart enough to realize that, hey, we can't mess with Nintendo like Pokemon, Mario Kart, Mario Parties. All of that is more family oriented and kid oriented. Which I'm starting to think that Sega never really caught on to it because Sonic the Hedgehog. He, he's been more of like the not the kids, but more like the preteen, the 13-year-old kind of like era there. I mean, if Sega had realized it quicker and you know um, marketed more adult, not adult content, but more mature games faster, I believe they may still have like a small dog in the race because Sega was pushing like they was pushing. They had the better systems. Uh, they had the better, more mature games versus Nintendo at this point. Um, what is it, Streets of Rage or Double Dragons? I always liked them better on the Sega Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. I thought it looked better. I thought it controlled better. They had the ABC button like right there. You didn't have the four buttons to or. So Genesis does what Nintendo don't. This is probably the Sega that everyone remembers. I know I do. To combat Nintendo's strength in North America, Sega sold itself as a faster, edgier option for gamers. I just almost said this. Mario was slow and heavy, Sonic was fast and light, SNES didn't show blood in fighting games, Genesis did, and Genesis had 16-bit high-speed gameplay, Nintendo didn't. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Who we got? City of Cons, what's going on, man? Glad you can make it. This push worked like gangbusters. Sega sold around 30.75 million units over the life of its many iterations. In addition to the original Genesis, Sega released the Genesis 2 and Genesis Nomad. What is that? Let's go look that up real quick. Genesis Nomad. Sega. Oh, okay. So they had a they had a handheld before Nintendo got to it. Let's see. The Genesis Nomad. Where was that at? Genesis Nomad, handheld console version. It also had many ill-fated peripheries that we will cover more in depth later. They carved out a foothold in the U.S. gaming market like they never had before, and Sega solidified a mascot that would endure to this very day. It was either be here or no. Well, I'm glad that you're here, man. How the pups doing? As I scroll on down here, it looks like it's going to talk about Sonic the Hedgehog here. Uh, again, the throwback for this episode is we're throwing it back to Sega. They're growing. That's always a good thing, man. How's Mama doing? Last time I checked in, she was still sleeping. She's still worn out. She's still, still lazy. Oh man, but yeah. This episode of Throwback is we're throwing back to Sega, man. We're going through the history of it a little bit, and then at the end of it, I'm gonna give my 2 cents, which I'm kind of doing in between, anyways. So we might just do the whole episode like that. Let's just see how it rolls. Sonic the Hedgehog was the answer to Mario. The Italian plumber and his friends Donkey Kong and Link had propelled the NES and SNES into superstardom. Sega needed something that could compete with the enduring icon, and the answer was Sonic, obviously. Sonic was the antithesis of Mario in every way at the time. Most games didn't have a save functionality, so players would have to quickly run through the initial levels to get to the better worlds. The Godfather of our childhoods. Yeah, he was all kind of in the background, wasn't he? uh, Functionality, so players would have to quickly run through the initial levels to get to the better worlds. With Mario, this was a slow, plodding process. Not so with the Blue Blur. Sonic picked up speed as he went, and the levels were designed to reward players who could utilize Sonic's speed. Throw in some bright colors and cute animals, and presto, instant mascot. The public response was Sonic's high-speed hijinks, the power of the Genesis, and Sega's pull-no-punches attitude. The Sega Genesis cemented itself in the pantheon of gaming history. But like we've seen before, Nintendo is king, and the SNES outsold the Genesis by selling almost 20 million more units. Wow. They really outsold them that much? Dang. I wouldn't believe that. I still kind of don't believe that. Everybody you talk to played both Nintendo, SNES, and the Sega, so I don't believe that like at all. Yeah, maybe it is right. I really don't feel like looking up console sales right now. So, wow, though. They might not be in the console game anymore, but their contribution to gaming is undeniable. We're going to go through the history of have we not been doing that? Its many consoles and their impact on gaming. For this list, we are just going with console and Sega's original canon. No re-releases or new digital versions of the consoles will be considered. So keep your hands and feet in the cart at all times. We're in for one hell of a ride. Alright, I had one of those. Man, that thing took 6 AA's in the back, and they died in like 2 hours. Game Gear. While the Sega Genesis was blowing minds in the console wars, Sega hoped they could compete with Nintendo's foray into handhelds, the Game Boy. This came in the form of Sega's Game Gear. The Game Gear was shaped more like a controller than a Game Boy and had much more impressive specs. It could play games in 16-bit and could even play games in color, which the first Game Boy could not. If you guessed that this is the point where I tell you that Sega was once again defeated by Nintendo, you'd be right. Obviously, the Game Boy, for some reason, got all the love. And it could be that, this thing took 6 AA's and died in like 3 hours. You'd be right. Sega always set its sights on powerful hardware and a better gaming experience than the other consoles on the market. Yes, we've been going over that. They did. They were pushing their consoles at an insane rate, and had they settled down and done more mascots like Nintendo at this point, they had Mario, Link, Donkey Kong. At the least, that's just saying the least of mascots and noteworthy titles that they could come out with, versus Sega had Sonic and noteworthy titles, not just the titles in general. And in this way, they always achieved what they were after, but they could never quite understand. What they can never quite understand is the content piece of gaming. Most players don't care about specs if the other system has better games. And Nintendo always had better games. Yeah, they had more AAA titles than Sega did, but I remember that Game Gear, man. I had a, what was it? I had Aladdin on that thing. And man, I'd be on that thing. I'd go through batteries like crazy when I had it. Man, it was absolutely crazy. How many batteries? Think about how many batteries. And when they first die, you turn it off real quick, let it sit for a minute, turn it back on, hoping you get a little bit more juice out of it. But you get like past that front title, and then it just die again. Mega CD and slash Sega CD 32X. Aiming to ride the success of the Genesis, Sega released two peripherals called Sega CD and 32X. Even though these are extensions of the Sega Genesis, they deserve separate consideration. So what have we got here? The Sega CD improved on the Genesis in so many ways that it can be a little reductive to call it an extension. In truth, it really was the fourth generation of Sega consoles. This peripheral supported bigger, more detailed games. It also traded the Genesis Zilog Z80 processor for the Motorola 68000, which had 12.5 MHz over the Z80's 3.58 MHz. As the name suggests, Sega CD played games off CDs instead of cartridges, which meant it could play larger, more detailed games. Yeah. Yeah. Where was that at now? Larger, more detailed games. Unfortunately, this does mark the downturn for Sega and Genesis and Sega as a whole. My goodness, I get it. Firstly, it limited sales to people who already had a Genesis, meaning it didn't really expand its share of the market. Sales were abysmal, only 2.2 million units were sold, a large departure from the excellent sales of the original Genesis. This is also the console that brought us Night Trap and the infamous congressional hearings. Night Trap? What is Night Trap? Does anybody know what Night Trap is? I'm gonna look at it. I have no idea what that is. Let's go to all. Night Trap. Night Trap is an interactive movie video game that uses full motion video to present the story and gameplay. Oh, okay. I remember hearing about that now. Night Trap is 92. Sega CD. Okay. I remember hearing about that now. Alright. Yeah, that game was a little bit ahead of its time, right? They used, like they said, it used actual actors and such in a video game format, which definitely made poor. They made a poor gaming decision in an age of when they needed to up the ante versus, doing something downright outside of the box. But that's going to be like a little consistent thing, because here we go with the 1993 violence and the congressional hearings, which brings in Mortal Kombat, the reason why they have the ratings on the games now. Night Trap was an FMV horror game about a group of teenage girls having a sleepover in a vampire-infested house. The player observes the girls in different scenarios, listens in on conversation, and triggers traps to protect the girls from those who would do them harm. The game isn't anything you wouldn't see in the horror B movies of the 80s. This, along with Mortal Kombat, which everybody knows they use the FMV like people, not the whole situation. And was brought in front of the Senate Committee on the subject of violent video games. Some committee members, like the Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, believed that games with this much graphic violence should be out of reach for children. Several stores that catered to children, like Toys R Us, took the game down from their store shelves. Sega even stopped producing copies of the game in January of 1994. Nintendo, ever the rival, even had their representative state that Nintendo was a family company and Night Trap would never exist on a Nintendo console. So someone should tell that to whoever ported it to the Switch in 2018. Still, this only bolstered Sega's reputation as an edgy company, and they were mostly happy to lean in. The 32X, the last peripheral for the Sega Genesis console. There was a debate between the Japanese and American offices of Sega whether this should be a peripheral or a full-on new console. In the end, the peripheral was released in both markets. The 32X main upgrade was its ability to play 32-bit games, meaning it would play ROM cartridges with more color and bigger, more detailed game worlds. The 32X was pitched to players as a cheaper alternative to the upcoming Sega Saturn console. They planned to run both consoles at the same time, but this isn't how it worked out. The 32X add-on only sold around 800,000 units and quickly faded from public view. Oh. I have heard of the 32X. I've never really seen one. Let's just let's get a look at it. Okay, so it really was just an add-on to like the Sega Genesis. You just put it down in the cartridge reader. Okay. I don't know why they would want to do that as a separate thing when at the time, uh, a lot of people probably had the Sega Genesis. Not as many as Nintendo, and they could just go buy this addition to their Genesis to be able to play the newer games. What is this? Power supply 2-in-1 for Sega Mega Drive / Genesis plus 32X retro game supply. What the hell is that thing? It's a disc reader. Okay. Okay, I'm done looking at that now.
Why are you gonna watch TV and charge a battery to a power tool?
No, it's for the old Sega Genesis. You wouldn't know nothing about that.
That sounds like Spanish to me.
Alright, so now we're on to the Sega Saturn, which was released as the much-awaited successor to Genesis. Sega had been teasing fans with their first new console in 5 years, so it was safe to say there was a fever pitch when the console's release date was announced at E3 in 1995. This now infamous announcement was the first step in a long string of failures for the Sega Saturn. Really? Sega Saturn. At E3 95, Sega announced that Sega Saturn was available for purchase that very day. Eager fans rushed to retailers to get the sought-after console. The problem was retailers had no idea this was coming. Stores like Walmart and Best Buy were so angry at Sega that they even refused to restock the Sega Saturn in some stores. In addition, Sony released the first PlayStation. Sony released the first PlayStation later that year for $100 cheaper than the Saturn. Okay. And as always, Nintendo flexed its dominance with the N64, which is in my opinion one of the greatest consoles of all time. Sorry, Sega. The Sega Saturn, I remember it. I played it quite a bit back when I was a teenager. Actually, probably more like a preteen.
You should have everything.
What's going on, Tiger? Yes, sir. We're going over Sega all night. Well, not all night until I decide that's it. Hopefully,
SWAT keeps interrupting.
hopefully SWAT quits barging in here on me with crazy requests. I do remember the Sega Saturn though. What game was it I played on there? It was I think Killer Instinct was one that I played on there. That was a really good game. But I didn't realize that the PlayStation was $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn. Or that it tried to release with the N64. I feel like at that point the only reason PlayStation even made an impact was people was kind of getting tired of Nintendo titles being too kid friendly, and they wanted a more edgier thing. And obviously, if Sega decided that they wanted more money, so I'm seeing the money problem already with Sega. Like I saw it up top, and that was going to be one of my things. That was why they collapsed the way they did, because somebody got a little bit too greedy. I want SOCOM to come back and love Killer Instinct. I think it was Killer Instinct, and there was another one that I used to play all the time on the Sega Saturn. I can't remember the games though, because I know it was Killer Instinct, and then there was another one. Ultra. So here it says, the Sega Saturn was plagued with the main problem of its predecessors. It just couldn't compete with Nintendo's stable of games. That's about everybody though. You got it on your PC? You got a SOCOM or Killer Instinct? Killer Instinct. I think I want to say that was the game that I played back, like way back in the day. It's been like 25 years ago now. One of those two. Nintendo's stable of games. Obviously, Nintendo went ahead and ran with their mascots. Like, they knew that was going to be their money. They dominated the kids friendly game, the family oriented game, and they still do that. You stream it for me? Oh, I appreciate it, man. On top of that, games were moving away from the highly detailed 2D sprites and into the realm of 3D. Both Nintendo and PlayStation were pioneering in this space while Sega lagged. They did try to catch up, but it wasn't enough. They also didn't make a new entry in the Sonic franchise. Sonic 4 had been long rumored, but Sega Saturn didn't deliver. Aw, man. Sonic games did come out, like Sonic R, a 3D racing game with Sonic characters, and Sonic 3D Blast. In the end, due to bad decisions, a very bizarre and confusing ad campaign, and the lack of strong titles, the Sega Saturn went into terminal decline. It only sold a total of 9.3 million copies. I'm gonna ad lib here too. 9.3 million consoles. Yeah, it'd be kind of cool to watch it again. They basically prostituted a dead rodent. Yeah. At that point, man, I can't believe they didn't release a Sonic 4 on the Sega Saturn. Now here, here comes my favorite of all time, the Sega console. Genesis was great. The Game Gear was alright for what it was. But here comes my favorite console Sega ever put out.
She's
And-
just looking at my leg.
Gonna need you to go on somewhere.
Teaching her bad habits.
Teaching her bad habits. The Sega Dreamcast. And there was a game I used to play on the Dreamcast. My cousin had it. And we would sit there for like 8 hours at a time, man. And we would sit there and play. I don't think it wasn't Final Fantasy because it didn't have the turn-by-turn fighting system. But it looked more like, it wasn't Soul Calibur. Like I'm seeing that down here. It wasn't Soul Calibur. But it was more of a fighting game, like a side-scroller fighting game. And I don't think it was Final Fantasy. Too bad my cousin doesn't ever really. You know what I'm talking about? Like but the character I liked the most had like this huge sword, and he was like kind of muscular in like a blue tunic. But it was a side scroller. It was still 2D, and it was a lot of fun. Like I can't remember the name of it. I would remember it if I seen it, right? Like I'd be like, oh yeah, that's. But no, man, this controller, man, and the system itself was ahead, a little bit ahead. Yes. Because I'm thinking that game, it had your health bar on the screen here as well as on on the television screen, and I think it had like a little avatar for the character you picked as well. But I don't believe it was. Yeah, I don't think it was Final Fantasy. The Dreamcast was the first system you played? Oh man, you got lucky then. Like I was saying earlier, the first system I can remember playing was the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, the Super Nintendo, or as I would call it, the Super Nintendo. But yeah, the Dreamcast, man, it was. I know that it had a port in the back for like a phone line or Ethernet cable. They had a lot of good games. Man, what? Because there was the one I'm thinking about. Then there was. It's the thing with Sega, right? They didn't have notable games, but they had fun games. And the systems that they would use to run them. They were always a little ahead, console-wise. The N64 came out before the Dreamcast, I believe. It came out with the Sega Saturn, 1995. Yeah. So it came out after the N64. The N64 pretty much killed Sega, because in that same year Sega released the Saturn, Nintendo done the N64. And the Dreamcast, does it say when it came out? In 98. Sega had a run of bad luck, starting with the failure of the Game Gear, the Sega CD, and 32X. Sega was on the ropes. Rivals in this space like Sony and Nintendo were pulling away technologically and creatively. Things were not looking good for Sega, so in one final effort to get back into the conversation, Sega released its swan song, the Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was released in 98 and had some initial success. It had some amazing launch titles, like Sonic Adventures, which was a personal favorite of the authors, and Soul Calibur. So Soul Calibur originally came out with Sega Dreamcast. It also included a VMU attachment in the controller, which doubled as a memory card and second screen. Games would use the VMU to show inventory maps and other heads-up display info. Despite some great games and some cutting-edge features, the Dreamcast was trounced by the release of the PlayStation 2 and the new player on the scene, Microsoft Xbox. Dreamcast, they only sold 9.1 million of those? Oh my goodness. Man. It just seems like there towards the end, they couldn't break 10 million. The fall of Sega consoles. Sega lost millions trying to compete, man. I bet, I'd almost put money on it, man, that if they came out with like a newer version of the Dreamcast, that it would, one, hit for nostalgia points, two, be more advanced than even the PS5 or the Xbox Series X or whatever it is now. Then again, they would have to sink a bit of money into it, so, but I really hate to see that they only sold 9.1 million units and discontinued in 2001. That's been 22 years. 22 years they discontinued this thing. Sega lost millions, yada yada. They are now a third-party developer who still have their hands on some legendary titles. They still produce new Sonic games, although the mixed reviews, and they work with all the major console companies, even Nintendo. In fact, it was a rumor that Sega had been purchased by Nintendo, but this isn't true. They just get along a lot better than they used to. Lasting impact on gaming. It's easy to look at the story of Sega as a tragic one. They seem to always be just a few steps behind what players and even their own fans expected, but Sega undoubtedly shaped the way that games have evolved over the years. Their edgy attitude showed the world that gaming isn't just a little kid activity, it can be so much more. Sure, they weren't the most highbrow titles, but they showed a capacity for more. Sega also pushed the game industry technologically until the Saturn. They always had the better tech. They may not have been able to capitalize on it, but they forced rivals to innovate. They didn't pull their punches and weren't afraid to be weird. That games industry owes a small part of its quirkiness to Sega. Sega is still very much a player in the gaming industry. They have crafted some amazing games for new fans as a third-party developer. They have their share of ups and downs, but the video game industry wouldn't be the same without them. One thing is for sure, Sonic Adventure 2 still slaps. Oh man. Let's cut that off. How you guys doing this evening? That was our throwback for the evening. We threw it all the way back to Sega. We read about Sega. Now we're gonna get our feelings out the way for it, right? Sega should have been better than what they should have been better than what they turned out to be. The Dreamcast apparently has a few places and quite a few hearts out there. The Dreamcast was a hell of a system. I believe had they promoted better, not gotten greedy with wanting to, sell their system for more than their competitors at the time, they might could still have a couple more years to fight in them. What is your damage? Your asshole. What?
Her schooling.
Still?
They the one that accepted again.
We'll get on that in a minute. Dreamcasts were absolutely fire. Man, I would open my arms up if Sega decided, hey, we're gonna do a Dreamcast 2. Like, get us back in the fight. I would definitely be on board with that. Sonic, they could do better with Sonic. They could do better with getting the bigger AAA titles. I would get two, no lie. And I would definitely be on board with a Sega Dreamcast 2 or X or whatever they felt like on it. Sega Dreamcast Dream Series for all I care. Uh, but this whole console war with Sony and Microsoft, uh, they're not really pushing each other. The old history was Sega and Nintendo. Sega pushed Nintendo to be better, and they had to be better to beat Sega just because Sega had the better consoles. They just didn't have the better titles. Uh, Sonic needs a major rewrite at this point. Which one is he again? But yeah, Xbox, Microsoft, and Sony, they're not really pushing each other. They're coming out with the bare minimum and advancements to make gamers happy. Versus back when Sega and Nintendo were going head to head, you've seen the innovations of the consoles coming out, the better processors, the different kind of controllers, the better interfaces, the better games. Uh, let's see. It was better back then. You got excited to hear about the new consoles coming out. Not now, we're coming out with the PS6. Okay, you ain't even really trying. You're just upping the number on it. But at this point, what's going to be new about it? Oh, you got backwards technology now. Yeah, you've been saying that.
Wait, they got a 6 coming out? Didn't they just release a 5?
It's a hypothetical.
Oh. Sorry, I'm just not coming in the middle of us. Been busy.
And the Xbox Series, like X, whatever they're gonna call themselves after this, or that, what is it? Xbox One, Xbox 1.2, or something like that. Let's see. Sony and Microsoft aren't really pushing the envelope like Sega versus Nintendo did. Sega Dreamcast. If it weren't for the people that were in control of it, if you had actual people that cared about more than just making money on their console, Sega would still be in the race. It was just yeah, bro. Sega had a lot of success in their early days. They really did. They pushed the envelope, and if it weren't for Nintendo having their mascots at early, like they had Donkey Kong, Link, and Mario super early. And then it took Sega a little bit to, say, hey, Sonic's going to be our mascot. And Sonic was a little bit edgier. Everybody liked to go fast. Ricky Bobby. I believe Sega would still be around today if people were to back in the day care about the processing power of the console they're playing with. Like, if they cared about it's kind of hard to get details in the little pixelated forms, but I don't know. I understand. You go with what you're comfortable with. And Sega didn't want people to be comfortable. Sega was that limit pusher. And like I said, we just threw it back on Sega tonight. Sega still deserved love. They pushed everything that they could until there was nothing left for them to push, or nobody helping them push. I believe I'm going to turn it over to the comments now. Let's see what they got. Imagine, bro, if Sega was a 21st century business, bro. They would be going crazy. Like in the 2010 eras. Oh, they would. They definitely would. They would have a PS3 before PS3 was thought about. Or PS4 or PS5. Like their first console would have been like a PS5. They would probably have all these AAA titles. Scared and like, if they came out today with the same kind of attitude as they have for everything and making the consoles better, they would have Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo all trying to push the limits. Probably would have been the best console. You know, Sega's still in the conversation. They may not make consoles anymore. I really hope to hear one day that they are making a new console. But if they came out at the same time as like Xbox, you know, with the Sega Dreamcast or whatever would come after that. Could you imagine the innovation we would have in gaming if they would have been able to continue? Man, we would be in virtual reality by already. We would be Sword Art Online IRL.
So are you saying that Sega would be like having Futurama in the house?
Yeah, pretty much. Sega would bring Futurama to life.
Sega would probably have one of them things like you've seen up at the Smoky Mountains where you hop in it and it moves you around.
Yeah.
I have a feeling like you'd be playing the game doing that shit.
You would be the game.
I don't know what we're talking about. I'm just pretty much going off of what's being said.
Sega was just a limit pusher. They pushed consoles to the absolute limit, and they made better consoles. It's just people didn't realize it. We all have fond memories of the ones of us that have played it.
I don't even know what we're talking about.
Sega was a console. Now they're just a developer, like a third-party developer. Sad. But yeah, that's been our throwback talk this week. As for some real talk, this weekend, probably Sunday, I'm going to be going over some analytics for my channel, and I am quite possibly going to be knocking 1 or 2 days off the schedule, just depending on how the analytics look. And just because I feel like I need to, you know, not wear myself out on doing this, and vice versa, wearing the viewers out. Uploading 5 days a week, twice on Fridays, and most of the time twice on Saturdays. I feel like I'm putting too much out there in such a small amount of time, right? If it comes back and the analytics look good for every day that I've done this, then maybe I'll keep up at 5 times a week. But I'm seriously doubting that that's gonna be. I know you guys are here. And I've appreciated the LOA family, the DeadWolvz family, everybody in the Discord. The Discord link for LOA and DeadWolvz is in the description. Those guys are great over there. They got a few of them in here right now. A bunch of swell people over there. But as I was saying, I'm gonna go over the analytics. I'm gonna take a look. I'm gonna look at viewers, concurrent view times. Whatever day I see is doing the worst will probably get knocked out. And I want to, spend a little extra time with my little one here. She just turned 5 this last Monday. We're trying to get her registered into school. The school system's being a pain in my backside. Actually, you can tell the school system to follow the link to the YouTube here. I'll tell them myself. But yeah, I don't want to leave it, and I feel like I've had a lot of fun doing it, but I do feel like the viewers would get fatigued and start dropping off, and I don't want that from you guys. I don't want to bore you guys into sleep every evening. I do want you guys to show up and have fun though.
Okay, don't bore them to sleep, but at least count them to sleep.
Count them to sleep. You guys need some sheep counted for you?
Now we gotta bring the SWAT in here to do it.
Yeah.
She's gotta teach them the lesson.
But with that being said, I appreciate all the love and support. Remember that you are loved. Love one another. Love yourselves. Take care of one another. And take care of yourselves. Until I see you next time, you guys have a great night. And that's going to be it from me.